on me on my belt. Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I am wanting to resume my series of lectures today. The summary is on the slide, and it starts with a recap. Now, yesterday's lecture was introductory to kind of set the problems I'm interested in this course. And the problems are really about interpreting this difficult and ambiguous notion, populism, and saying something about the opposition to populism and the criticism of populism. And yesterday I was concentrating mainly on Brexit and Trump, which are the two kind of biggest populist events as far as most of us are concerned, although, as I stressed yesterday, we are supposedly seeing a populist wave also in Latin America, the so-called pink wave in Latin America. We've got populists in Eastern Europe, and we've got a handful of populists also in Asia, in the Philippines and in India. So it's supposedly a worldwide movement, but as I pointed out yesterday, it's very diverse, and there's some sort of question about whether people are not just using the term as a term of abuse. People who dislike political movements will denounce them by calling them populist. But I was concentrating on what seems to me the best effort to provide a recent analytical assessment of the notion of populism, trying to develop a concept which will be reasonably precise and definitely useful, and that was the work of Jan Werner Müller, a book called What is Populism? And I explained his ideas about populism yesterday, that it is primarily a rhetorical trope. We the people. People who are populists are very fond of saying, we the people believe this or want to do that or something like that. And it goes with a series of attitudes which are anti-pluralist, anti-elitist, moralistic, and puristic. So the tendency is to excommunicate from the people various individuals who don't meet the moral criteria of being worthy of belonging to the true people, and generally taking the view that the people must have a single philosophy and a single set of attitudes and views on everything, and therefore populists are often quite undemocratic and intolerant. But this is a kind of consequence of the negative side of populism. Populism is a kind of shadow of true democracy. It's the way Jan Werner Müller puts it. And it will be found in many democratic systems wherever you have a group of people who are ready to usurp the claim of being the true people. So that's Jan Werner Müller's concept, and I look at some examples from Trump and Brexit. Trump talking about the unification of the people is the most important thing. All the rest don't matter. And of course, in the British case, the tabloids denouncing the judges as being enemies of the people. both examples of populist rhetoric. But I also pointed out that the anti-populists often go overboard in stressing the analogy between Trump and Hitler, both of whom were populists, and I looked at some of the earlier antecedents, but I mainly was concerned with the people who voted for Trump and Brexit, and particularly the American working class supporters of Trump, who I characterized following a wonderful book by the historian Thomas Frank as being kind of ex-working class or working class Americans who live in the center of the country but have seen rough times in recent years with the Republican Party getting the support of these people on cultural lines while doing nothing for their economic plight. And in some sense, the revolt of the masses in the Trump election was an attempt to return to the economic agenda of past years, where the decline of American manufacturing, the collapse of the good jobs, the hollowing out of the middle classes was combated effectively from the top. And this is Trump's message about Make America Great Again. And of course there are some doubts about whether he'll be able to succeed in that, and I'm going to talk about those later in the week. But the lecture yesterday finished with a splendid YouTube video from Anne Case and Angus Deaton about the plight of an awful lot of middle Americans who are faced with severe economic challenges and are responding to adversity by kind of taking alcohol and opioids and similar kinds of things and committing suicide in large numbers. So this very worrying trend of deaths of despair. And that was the note on which I finished yesterday's lecture. Now today I'm going in a completely different direction. I'm going to be going back more than 100 years. So it's called Populism in History, and it's about Russia. Because Russian populism in the 19th century is one of the two great examples of populism in history. The other is the American populism, which I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. And although these situations are very, very different from today's situation, I think one does get some sort of overview and some sort of information about the general case of invocation of the people in politics by looking at Russian populism. It's an absolutely fascinating subject in itself, and it's been written up by a very great historian, Franco Venturi, this book, Roots of Revolution. I see I've had it on my shelves for more than 50 years, and I bought it for £2.50 many, many years ago, and it's stayed with me ever since. Absolutely great book, and it's going to be the centerpiece of what I'm talking about today. But I'm concerned to kind of put forward a rather different interpretation from the standard one of Russian history and the Russian Revolution, because the standard one has been dominated by Marxism and reads everything kind of backwards. You kind of find in too many books about Russian history that Lenin is assumed to be inevitable. Whereas I think Lenin was actually somewhat accidental. If it hadn't been for the First World War, Lenin would have been a footnote in history. So it was the German High Command putting Lenin in the SEAL train and sending him back to Russia, which was the decisive thing for the establishment of communism in Russia. If that event had not happened, there would have been a Russian Revolution, but it would have been very different because it would have been dominated by populists. So that's the one of the themes in today's lecture. So I need to, however, tell you some very basic things about Russian history, which again are often kind of ignored or got wrong. But there's been wonderful work, mainly by Western historians over the last 100 years on the history of Russia. Western social historians, I think, in particular, and I'm going to single out 2 or 3 of them who I think are really wonderful people and underappreciated. There's been good work, of course, by Russians as well, but the Russians working on the subject, of course, usually kind of were subject to very severe handicaps. So the best Russian work on the subject is usually highly technical and specialized. You don't get a kind of grand alternative overview of Russian history from many of the Russian sources, whereas you do from a fair number of the Western sources. I want to start with the simple grand narrative about social evolution, which has been around for more than 200 years. It goes back to the rationalist historians of the 18th century, to the Baron de Montesquieu in France, who was one of the great legal historians and a great liberal, and of course he put the notion of feudalism on the map. But that was then developed by a number of French writers, Turgot and company, and then by Adam Smith. So Adam Smith fits this feudal picture into a picture of grand evolution with 4 stages of society, and then this gets taken up in the 19th century by Karl Marx, and the part of the sequence which everybody agrees on is that in antiquity we had slavery, and it was followed by feudalism, and that was followed by capitalism. So, this is the sort of standard, simplest kind of picture of historical evolution of society. It's what's often called a grand narrative because other narratives are generally fitted inside this particular line of historical evolution. Now, what sort of happened, of course, since the time of Karl Marx has been that this picture has tended to be obliterated. The simple picture is no longer, I think, believed by too many people, particularly in the West, where we want to tell very complex stories nowadays about the evolution of France, say. But this simple picture has also been obliterated in the Russian case, although this is less frequently understood or realized, I think. And I want to mention 2 complications in the Russian case. The basic story, slavery in antiquity, was the major economic formation governing society. The great latifundia of the Roman world were major enterprises which hundreds of slaves were put to work on plantations. But as law and order broke down in late antiquity, the slaves tended to escape or revolt or be tied down to particular pieces of property, and so we get the evolution of serfdom, where a dependent labourer is tied to a piece of land, and when the land is sold, the serf is sold along with the land. And that's the characteristic feature of serfdom. And serfdom, of course, like slavery, can be a tremendously oppressive system. One knows all sorts of horror stories about masters beating their serfs just as they inflicted whiplashes on their slaves. We know about masters exercising the jus primi noctis to have sexual services from the slaves. We know all these sorts of things. But there is a fairly sort of straightforward line there of dependent labour changes from slavery, where slaves get sold as individuals, or sometimes as families, or sometimes as going businesses, but there's a transition to the medieval form where the serf is tied to the land, and it's when the land changes hands that the serf also changes hands. But this is too simple for Russia, because at the end of the Middle Ages, when serfdom had extensively broken down in Eastern Europe, we get the so-called second serfdom, which is an extraordinary transformation. It affects not only Russia, but also Poland and various countries in what became the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia, similar sorts of places. It's one of these things which has puzzled historians. You can easily understand how serfdom breaks down. Basically, the serfs revolt, they run away, you get changes in the law, or you get various other sorts of problems with the functioning of serfdom. But why it should come back is much harder to understand, and there's been very lively debate about this, particularly among Polish historians. But the extraordinary thing is that it came back in Russia, but when it came back, slavery also came back. So you get situations where you have grand landed estates with so many 400 serfs, or souls as they were usually called in Russia, attached to the estate. But you also get situations where individuals get sold in a market for slaves. But there's an additional complication in that it turns out that the emergent Muscovite state was a major owner of slaves. So that we get a return of slavery and more generally the rise of forced labour. We get the emergence of the first penal settlements, these things which became so important in Russian history. In fact, I often think that it's important when talking about Russia to remind people that there are extraordinary continuities in the history. There's been forced labour in Russia for a period of 500 years. It wasn't something introduced by the communists. Similarly, there's been an excessively strong state guarded by a fanatical corps of secret police, also ever since the time of Ivan the Terrible. So amazing kind of continuities in Russian history, and these need to be taken into account. It wasn't just all the fault of Lenin and Stalin. Now, the crucial thing from our point of view is the kind of rationalization which occurs in the system in the 18th century at the hands of this man, Peter the Great. Ivan the Terrible already had kind of brought the aristocracy to heel and established a kind of proto-totalitarian state with a strong secret police. But Peter the Great, who was a westernizer and who famously traveled to the West and visited places like Amsterdam and London, and briefly worked in the shipyards in Amsterdam in order to acquire Western technology. Peter the Great was a tremendous reformer. He wanted the country to have a new capital, and so that was St. Petersburg. He wanted to bring the Orthodox Church, or the Russian Orthodox Church, in line with the Greek Orthodox Church. So he reformed the Orthodox Church and split the church into new believers and old believers. But from our point of view, the really important thing he did was to establish an extraordinary kind of uniform bureaucratic system throughout Russia by organizing that the entire country should be kind of shepherded into a single hierarchy, which is a system of 12 ranks. And you'll see that on the slide on the right-hand side the table of ranks. This is the actual document where Peter sets out how he's going to stratify the society, and it's on kind of military lines. You're going to have sort of supreme military men, the generals and similar people at the top, and there are going to be grades all the way down where you're going to locate local bureaucrats, where you're going to locate the local police, where you're going to locate the local postmaster. So the whole society gets ranked in this extraordinary process of establishing the table of ranks. And coupled with this is a reform of the educational system, so that an elite core of bureaucrats can be established to run the state. It's absolutely extraordinary process of centralization, and again, amazing kind of continuities in Russian history, because we know that the Soviet Union was also an extraordinarily centralized society. The clocks were synchronized so that Stalin could follow what was going on in the Far East and the borders of Europe from Moscow, and keep his eye on the whole system from the center. Now, the important thing about the table of ranks is, as I said, it establishes this extraordinary uniform hierarchy. It's difficult to think of other examples like it. There were some attempts in Germany, and my knowledge of this is entirely derived from the work of one historian, the great Mark Rafe. This book here I have. And again, I've had this for many years, but I see I bought this in America. It's $15, but also must have been a long time ago. It's called The Well-Ordered Police State. The social institutional change through law in the Germanies and Russia from 1600 to 1800. And it's an amazing description of how even the little German states, and you must remember that the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation split the German nation up into an enormous number, more than 1,000 little principalities, each of which claimed kind of the relative sovereignty of being an imperial power. And some of those states, of course, were quite substantial, notably Prussia and Bavaria and similar kinds of parts of Germany which we still recognize. And some of them attempted this process of bureaucratic reorganization and legal reorganization along the same lines as Peter the Great. And the German system is usually known as cameralism. And is in some ways quite remarkable because of the economic theorizing which went with it, and and other kinds of theorizing as well. It's often forgotten that Linnaeus, the great Swedish botanist, started life as a cameralist. And thought of his activities as a scientist as not merely classifying plants and animals, but also organizing the natural world so that it could be useful to the state. So this is an extraordinary kind of development in Northern and Eastern Europe, which many people in the West, I think, are not aware of and are not sufficiently aware of in relation to Russia. It tends to be one of those things which Russian specialists look into if they write about the 17th and 18th centuries, but they take as sort of background which doesn't need to be looked at when you're writing about the 19th century. And that's a mistake. Because Margrave's great insight in his other book, the one which I don't have here, about the origins of the Russian intelligentsia, is that Russia developed this extraordinary group of people, the Russian intelligentsia, out of the bureaucratic state created by Peter the Great. Now, this probably needs a little bit more explanation. We have in the West this notion of an intellectual, and often, of course, the term goes with certain presuppositions, certain language. Karl Mannheim used to talk about free-floating intellectuals, intellectuals who were not kind of part of a church or a university, so that there was a diversity of intellectuals in the West. But in Russia, there emerged during the course of the 18th century a class of persons who were intellectuals but who had a very special kind of social status. And this was recognized by the development of a peculiar Russian vocabulary about it, the notion of a person being an intelligent, and the plural is intelligentsia. And the intelligentsia were people who had had an education in the standard ranked system set up by Peter the Great, but who had dropped out. They were either people who'd failed examinations, or they were civil servants who had been fired, or had resigned, or had been sacked, and they were independent, and they were troublemakers right from the 18th century. They were. It was not a case of kind of free-floating intellectuals as in the West. These people were very often dependent, but of course indirectly dependent. They were sons who had failed a civil service examination and therefore had to be supported by the family. They were déclassé aristocrats. A whole variety of these people, but they all came out of this bureaucratic system, and so Margrave has argued that this is the key thing to understanding this peculiar Russian institution of the intelligentsia, which doesn't really exist in other countries. And again, blow me, it's amazing continuity. When I Googled intelligentsia yesterday, I went straight to the Russian government website, and there you get a video of Vladimir Putin addressing a meeting of the rural intelligentsia. They even exist today, and they have a kind of quasi-official status. It's a kind of an amazing continuity in Russian history. But the intelligentsia, of course, in the 19th century were the people who were the dissident intellectuals. They were the participants in the famous Decembrist uprising against Tsarism, which happened in the 1820s. They were the participants in the disturbances of 1848. And of course, they were the pioneer revolutionaries in the 1870s and 1880s, and it's to them that we need to look for understanding the roots of the Russian Revolution. And now I want to switch to my true hero for today, who's the great Italian historian Franco Venturi. I already mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. He himself, incidentally, is an interesting person. He was the son of the great Italian art historian Leonello Venturi, and he didn't start out as a historian. He was looking around for a career in the immediate post-1945 period, and briefly worked as a diplomat in the Italian embassy in Moscow. And it was while he was in Russia that he started to work in the Russian archives on the prehistory of the revolution. Working on 1917 and the history of the Communist Party was too sensitive. None of the documents were available, especially to foreigners. He therefore went further back and asked this question, which perhaps hadn't been asked too clearly before, about the roots of revolution in the pre-Marxist movements, the movements of the intelligentsia from 1848, which was a year of revolution throughout Europe. He discerned, and of course this was not an original observation, but he clarified it greatly, that there were 3 or 4 strands among the intelligentsia at that time. There were the anarchists, people who were believers in no government, and there were the people who were socialists and who eventually became communists, and there was this third